this is Andrew from Talking ESL, back with part 2 of my little mini-series on task-based learning. So without further ado, let's begin part 2. So this video obviously follows on from part 1, which I hope you've watched. But if you haven't, well, in the introductory video, we covered the methodological basis for task-based learning. We looked at exercises, activities and tasks, the differences between those, and how we can apply them in the communicative classroom. We also spent quite a bit of time discussing the communicative classroom and what that actually means in a modern context. I also introduced the idea of implicit or explicit teaching, which I'm going to build on further in this video, along with the theory or the research on mental representation. And also at this point I'd like to recommend another video of mine, which is quite an old one, but it's called Is Grammar Important? And I think that video ties in nicely with what we're trying to achieve here. So, implicit or explicit teaching. Well, throughout history, languages generally have been taught explicitly. What I mean by this is explicit teaching is when the instructor or the teacher clearly outlines what the learning goals are for the student and offers clear, unambiguous explanations of the skills and information structures they are presenting. I'll give an example of this in a moment to make it become a little bit more clearer for you. These are often included in the introduction to a chapter in a textbook, for example. At this point also, I've got another video on introducing teaching methods, which is quite a long video, but it should be applicable for this. Okay, so this is an example of explicit teaching. Paradigms. So what are paradigms? Simply lists of conjugations, inflections, declensions, etc. that are traditionally presented, much like you can see on the screen, with a verb paradigm. So we have the stem, the present participle, past tense participle, so show, shows, I show, you show, he shows, etc., which is traditionally how language is presented in the classroom. Implicit teaching, on the other hand, which is where we're going to go with task-based learning, this is teaching where the instructor does not outline such goals or make such explanations overtly. You need to think of pop-up grammar, quick explanations to help the students, rather than formal grammar presentations. But here, in implicit teaching, the teacher presents the information of the problem to the student and allows the student to make their own conclusions and create their own conceptual structures and assimilate the information in a way that makes the most sense to them. So this is heading directly towards task-based learning. It helps the students to develop their mental representation, which I'll come to in a moment. And as we saw in the previous video, these techniques are not given as much attention as they ought to be given if you want a truly communicative classroom. So, mental representation, what is it? Quite a busy slide here, but basically the idea is that language is not something to be learned like other subjects with explicit teaching, for example. So mental representation, well, it refers to the abstract, implicit and underlying linguistic system in a speaker's mind. It shows that language is abstract because it's not tangible. It's not a prescriptive set of grammar rules. Rather than that, it's a collection of abstractions from which our grammar rules are derived. So our textbooks or grammar references are not what physically and mentally occur in a speaker's mind when they use language. These reference books are used to describe what happens, or in an attempt to describe what happens. For example, let's take grammar. If we look at somebody who's an expert in English grammar, like Noam Chomsky, for example, we can say, let's make this relevant to a size we can all relate to, a circular shape. So Noam Chomsky has an understanding of grammar the size of a football, okay? Then if we go a step down, perhaps linguists or grammarians have an understanding of grammar that's not the size of Chomsky's football, but is slightly smaller and the size of a grapefruit. And then teachers, even a good grammar teacher might have understanding of grammar the size of an onion. And the best students have an understanding the size of a golf ball, for example. But the idea is that the grammar books or textbooks are recording the different levels of grammar that people understand, okay? Mental representation is implicit as exists outside of our awareness. for non-linguists anyway, for people who don't study linguistics. To give you an example of this, in English we say the big black cat, not the cat black big. And many speakers of English can't describe why the second example here is grammatically unacceptable. So this knowledge exists outside of their awareness. So this idea of mental representation demonstrates that language is abstract, and sometimes explicit teaching is not appropriate. It's difficult to process something which is explicit and make it abstract in the mind. So to conclude here, mental representation includes all of the formal features of a language such as lexicon, syntax, phonology, and semantics. It underlines our language use by letting us know both what is possible and what is impossible in a language. So how do we develop this mental representation? Well, really it's the sum of three parts. We have the universal grammar, which is something uniquely human. It's a genetic abstract knowledge system to which all language must adhere, and in first language acquisition studies, second language acquisition studies, universal grammar is one of the key fundamental theories. B, we have input, which is the language to which people are exposed, and this can be maximised or minimised in the classroom environment. And C, we've also got the parsing processes. So parsing processes are the ways in which the brain interprets the input through universal grammar to arrive at comprehension. These processes happen in real time whilst we're using the language. So to continue a little further with this, with input processing and parsing, learners are actively processing the input. The purpose of input here is not to isolate grammar or vocabulary. So input processing is implicit, not explicit, which is true in the case of noticing, for example. Parsing, as I just mentioned, is defined as the real-time computation of sentence structure during comprehension. When you hear the dog in a noun phrase, you probably think that dog is going to be the subject of the sentence. This real-time computation allows you to build sentence structure as you interact. This still does not explain ungrammaticality or hidden meaning, which I alluded to in the previous video as well, within the context of noticing. So the answer to this is ungrammaticality is not acquired, it just exists. It's a result of interaction of universal grammar and the processing of input creating the grammar in your head. So you don't have to acquire ungrammaticality, it just happens, much like grammaticality. There are numerous examples I can give for this, such as re can be used with some verbs and not others. Like redo the homework is fine, but re-pet the dog is ungrammatical. Also, there are hidden constraints through universal grammar and the language learning mechanisms in your head that keep you from doing things because of the way language itself works. These are deep ingrained properties of language that are available to everybody. They don't need to be acquired because they are there. As your grammar grows processing input data, these constraints automatically apply to the language that you are learning, so this is how you will acquire a lot of ungrammaticality. Some models on ungrammaticality are predicated by the idea that if you don't hear something in input, it's probably ungrammatical. That doesn't necessarily work well, because you have to know things are ungrammatical as well, that even though you never hear them in input. So you can know something is grammatical or if something is ungrammatical, even though you haven't heard it yet. So mental representation does explain this when combined with universal grammar. And just to finish off on universal grammar, it's a linguistics construct defined as an innate or inherent set of constraints or principles and a set of features that are common to all human languages. A feature is, for example, tense, which refers to whether a sentence is marked for a time frame or not, that's to say past, present or future. Language can draw from these features, it cannot invent different ones. One principle or constraint is phrase structure. All languages consist of a head, complement and specifier. The head gives the phrase its identity, such as a verb or noun phrase, and these are built into languages. Principle and constraints are relevant to all languages. Spanish selects for tense and distinguishes between infinite and finite structures. Chinese does not distinguish between tensed and non-tensed sentences. Various features of universal grammar are what are at play to make languages different or very similar, such as Classical Latin and Japanese, which are structurally very similar. So, with the mental representation, we've demonstrated that language is abstract and sometimes implicit teaching may not be appropriate, because it's difficult to process something which is explicit and make it abstract in the mind. So some kind of acquisition process which is implicit is necessary in the classroom. However, although mental representation is not open to outside influences, it doesn't mean that instruction cannot make a difference. But we can avoid this kind of explicit teaching completely. Well, we can't, because we've got standardised national or international exams that assess this kind of information and understanding. We take the Cambridge Preliminary English Test or the First Certificate as examples. We see the titles such as the Use of English, which test linguistic or grammatical knowledge in a variety of ways. Also, for example, the Spanish education system in which my students are schooled. The summative assessments are mainly comprised of what teachers and students call grammar tests. These are in no shape, way or form based on communicative competence, but are based on the understanding of grammatical rules or descriptions of language. The goals of these classes and this kind of syllabus is explicit knowledge of language. So far we've looked at learning or acquiring language which is ungrammatical. This continues. This is something that doesn't happen in exams, but in a communicative context it absolutely should. So ungrammaticality is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as not conforming to the rules and principles of accepted grammar usage. What about words which do not apply to usage with prefixes and suffixes? For example, the most frequently used prefixes in English are anti, meaning contrary to or against, as in antifreeze, in, ill, meaning not, such as unteachable, n, mean cause to, as in encode. And for suffixes, well, we've got able, can be done, such as inflatable, itty, for the state of something like impartiality, yon or chon, for the active process, such as demonstration, and I haven't included any verb endings here. But if you look at the word stem teach and arrived at unteachable, we could also create a perfectly correct word like unteachability, the state or condition of being unteachable. But we cannot really use unteachabilization to describe the process of making something unteachable. The universal grammar and input combine to inform us that this new word is not correct, or perhaps you may now adopt it, unteachabilization. But that just generally shows us where mental representation, universal grammar combine and are used in a more communicative way than explicit teaching could ever hope to deliver. Another thing on paradigms, people don't memorize them. Lists of conjugations, inflections, declensions and so on, are they real? Well, no, they're not, because people don't have them in their heads. They're a way of talking about language, but they're not real, as this information is not stored in the brain in a paradigm structure. Even if you are explicitly taught verb endings, like in Spanish, where there are dozens of them, that's not how you remember them. You don't learn the root and then an ending and combine them. Your mental lexicon builds up over time to form patterns. You can then split roots and endings when using new verbs or to understand words which you've not heard of before. So language is not what people think it is. Mental representation touched on this quite clearly. So what we've learned so far just now in quite a heavy theoretical video, but we know about language. It's an implicit abstract representation, but the rules we know are not the rules in your head, and mental representation is nothing like pedagogical grammatical rules in grammar books. So what we don't know, which I've mentioned before, is that means do again. So re-record, remake, redo. Do these things again, that's fine. Possible with some verbs, resurface, another one, but not others. The example I gave of repet. Another example of what we don't know, ain't. Well, it isn't good English, but I ain't got none versus I ain't have any. How would you define that in a grammatical way? Where could you give me the rule for this from? You probably can't, but you know that the second example isn't very good. It's in your head. So what's in our heads is we have the information that governs what is possible and what is not possible, and also the networks that encode meaning and grammatical information. We don't have the rules in the sense that we teach or discuss as language teachers. Imagine trying to learn to swim by reading a book about swimming. You wouldn't be able to do it. And this is a similar theory, that in order to speak a language, you don't need to learn about it, you need to use it, you need to be a language user. And that's what task-based learning has at its heart. So we've looked at the methodology, we've discussed mental representation, and touched on how language ends up in our heads. So I hope you can see that in emphasising task-based learning, well, it should be the backbone of any modern communicative classroom. And as I mentioned in the first video, we're about to release a series of books on task-based learning activities for the classroom, designed to be complementary material or designed to be used weekly in class. These will cover different levels of the CEFR, and there are 12 real-life tasks in each level. They have clear task structures, preparation, the task, and evaluations. So shortly we'll release a video about how these books work in the classroom. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please write them in the comments section below. Thank you very much.